you've heard this criticism. Joe Scarborough said you were an ideologue and a joke. That the notion of 73 or 74% there was silly, and then you fired back and said that Joe was math challenged.
So the
what
thing
doesn't
about
Joe understand?
Well, Joe is not using a lot of different subjects that I learned in school. He's not using math, number one, where you can actually say how often does a 2-point lead hold up. He's not using history in the sense you can actually use historical data to inform your opinion about things. And so, I think he's not using civics, and he's not looking at the Electoral College.
Are you saying that, basically all I am arguing is that if you look at elections in the past, when somebody has had Obama's lead by the average of the polls, 75% of the time that person wins. Is that it?
That's all we're saying. It's a real simple
This is rather fundamental, isn't it?
Real fundamental. It's at this point in time, our model basically averages the polls and then simulates the Electoral College.
And looked at the average of the polls in other previous presidential elections and said 75%.
Exactly.
What we have now matches what was back then the incumbent won or the person who was ahead in the polls won.
Mm-hmm. That's all we're doing.
Why then are you so controversial?
I don't know. I think it's because I think partly because we have this forecast which is very stable. We've had Obama ahead by about the same margin all year in the States, as you mentioned. I think sometimes pundits like to create the impression that things are wildly changing every minute and that states are coming into play and dropping out of play, when usually most voters are basing their votes on pretty solid fundamental things. The economy.
Go ahead.
So they're not flipping as much as maybe the conventional wisdom might. I think I get a lot of grief because I frustrate narratives that are told by pundits and journalists that don't have a lot of grounding in objective reality, frankly.
The other argument against you is that you are biased, that you acknowledge that you favor the president, and that therefore that creeps into the numbers you look at.
Well, I don't intend to vote this year.
You've heard? Oh, really?
Yeah, I don't. Since I joined the Times, I haven't voted.
They don't let you vote if you join the Times?
No, it's my decision. That doesn't mean I don't have political views, but
right. Your political views do favor the views of the president rather than the views of Governor Romney.
I'd say I'm somewhere in between being a libertarian and a liberal. So if I were to vote, it'd be kind of a Gary Johnson versus Mitt Romney decision, I suppose. But I do think we designed this model in the spring.
Idea how close liberals may be to libertarians.
I designed this model in the spring before we had any sense for how these polls would play out. We don't change the model. This was the same model that in 2010 said that Republicans were going to do very well in the House, that actually underestimated their gains in the Senate. I think a lot of people in politics don't really have a lot of confidence about their own ability to perceive the truth. I think a lot of people don't have maybe a lot of sense that the truth matters, right? And so to them, everything is spin. If you're talking to someone whose entire purpose is to spin results in as favorable as a way as they possibly can for their campaigns, and they assume that everyone else is tainted by the same disease that they have, and that there is no objective attempt to perceive reality. Or you go the other extreme where you have the kind of he said, she said style of a lot of journalist coverage that I think also does a disservice to people.
What would have to happen for Governor Romney to win?
Well, I think it probably comes down to turnout, where the polls are agreed that if every registered voter turned out, Obama would almost certainly win. And the question is, how much more enthusiastic will Romney's supporters be? Will Obama have more of an advantage in the swing states with this ground game stuff we talked about than in other states potentially? There are years when the polls have been off. In 1980, Jimmy Carter was supposed to be in a very close race with Ronald Reagan, lost in a landslide. So you can look at those.
Was that because there was a late-minute switch to Reagan, or because they simply did the polls badly?
Probably a combination of both. I think in now polls use what are called likely voter models, so they do account for will this person actually vote. That was less common in the 1980s and so back then you did have years where the polls tended to underestimate how much Republican enthusiasm there might be. Usually Republicans are more enthusiastic, a little easier to kind of group and get out to the polls than Democrats are.
How do you factor in also this notion that David Brooks, again, one of them said that somehow polls are often in error because they can't measure human behavior?
Well, polls do a good, it's kind of like any type of economic data, where if you look at
human behavior, not measure, but predict.
Well, if you look at the BLS reports, the economic data, that's based on survey data, right? And people's interpretations of do they have a job now might be subjective to some degree, but we can go and look and say how accurate are those jobs reports as an indicator of the overall economy. So to me, it's an empirical question: how accurate are polls? We know in presidential primaries, for example, polls miss all the time. You have to be much more careful. But we do know, based on half a century's worth of data, about how accurate polls are in general elections.
So the signal and the noise, why so many predictions fail and some don't? What's the answer to that question?
I think part of the reason that predictions fail is that people want a perfect answer to things. They want certainty. They want 100% answers. Whereas usually when you think of things in terms of probabilities, you have more success because there are limits on what we know and what we don't know, and a lot of predictions about separating out those two things to say, here's all the information we have. Based on this information, here are the chances I think that we'll have a severe impact of this hurricane in New York. We'll have the subways flooded. Here's what we don't know. Here are the known unknowns, maybe even the unknown unknowns potentially. And so trying to reconcile the difference between this big, crazy universe that we exist in and our knowledge of it, you meet somewhere in between. And that's with probability. But it doesn't work very well in the world of punditry sometimes.
And separating the signal and the noise means what?
It means learning how to work with information to perceive where the real value is there. I think sometimes people tend to overrate the value at the margin of new data that they see, where you see so many economic statistics, so many polls, that people tend to go a little bit haywire and change their views about the economy or the election every few minutes. In fact, it's usually better to realize that any one poll is not all that good an indicator, just like any one economic statistic. But if you take them all together, and they also show the same story, that 9 out of 10 of the polls in Ohio, not every one, but 9 out of the last 10 show Obama ahead, that becomes more meaningful.
The unemployment rate has dipped down below 8% in one BLS accounting. Yet there are also a range of statistical evidence that no president has been elected or re-elected if, in fact, in his previous 4 years, the unemployment rate was over 8%. Does that mean anything to you?
Well, you had FDR reelected
right.
in 1936 with an unemployment rate that was near, I think, 13%. And the reason why is that the trajectory had been favorable because it had been 20%.
So the exception is, where is the trajectory?
Well, and the other thing now is on the one hand, you're not that far from some losing presidents, but on the other hand, you're not that far from Reagan, where unemployment was in the low to mid-7s when voters went to the polls in 1984. And he didn't squeak out and win over Walter Mondale. He won by 18 points.
There's a premium in today's world for the ability to assess the data that's coming in.
Yeah, and you see this everywhere from